Hi everyone, Samir and Sumit here, and welcome back to our Formula One podcast.
Today we'll be talking about the 2023 Canadian Grand Prix.
Yeah, and this was a pretty decent race. I would say it's like pretty much what we've seen so far in 2023, but the qualifying was good. I really enjoyed quali.
Qualifying, I think, was really interesting, but also in the race too. It was like there were a lot of overtakes going on.
Yeah.
But as usual, Verstappen and Red Bull just ran away with it.
Yeah. So coming into this weekend, the big stories were Red Bull would be looking to get their 100th win in Formula One. And in terms of upgrades too, Aston Martin brought some upgrades on their car. So it would be interesting to see how they would perform against the rest of the field.
Yeah, and interestingly, going into this weekend, Mercedes thought they were going to be on the back foot. Like
Yeah.
they had a really good weekend in Spain, but then they thought they would have a not so good weekend in Canada, but as it turned out later, they had some pretty decent pace.
Yeah. So moving on into FP1, the thing about FP1 is that it was actually suspended because early on in the session we saw an Alpine, one of the Alpines pull over and they
It was
retired. Pierre Gasly retired from the session, but then there was a problem with F1's CCTV thing. One of the softwares that F1 uses to track all the cars' locations and positions on the track, which is crucial for like deploying safety cars or yellow flags and stuff like that. So
It's just a big safety measure, basically,
Yeah.
and the FIA can see where the cars are on track, and so without that, it would be like extremely hazardous because the FIA wouldn't know like exactly where the cars are.
yeah, so for that reason they had to they were trying to fix that, and that took like almost all of the sessions. So the drivers pretty much got no running time at all. So even the fans who showed up there, they were sat there like for nothing.
Yeah.
So they suspended that, and so instead they extended FP2 by 30 minutes.
I think that was a good call. So
Yeah.
because there was no running in FP1, so extending FP2 was nice.
Yeah, so moving on into FP2 then. So the session was extended so that the drivers could do the stuff that they wanted in FP1. They could just do it now in FP2. And immediately we saw Verstappen and the Red Bulls seemed like they weren't able to match the pace of the Mercedes, because we saw surprisingly in practice too, it was actually a Mercedes 1-2 with Lewis Hamilton, the most successful driver in Canada. He was P1 and then George Russell was P2.
So interestingly, they showed really good pace
Yeah.
with the Mercedes, but then again, it was just FP2. Like all the drivers, almost all of
Yeah.
them had to get track time in. So it was good for Mercedes to be up there, but at the same time, it wasn't representative.
Yeah. So early on in the session, first it was dry conditions. So the drivers all like they did soft tire running. We saw medium tire running from different teams. Everyone doing their stuff in FP1 they would do now. But we saw Verstappen also having some issues with his gearbox. He was saying the downshifts were a joke. So he was clearly not happy with the way that his car was downshifting. So that would be something that Red Bull need to look at.
Yeah, I mean, it was we never really saw much of that like with Verstappen like have those complaints during
Yeah.
free practice. So it was pretty unusual to see here. But Red Bull eventually did get that sorted out.
Yeah, and Mercedes obviously were flying too. Lewis Hamilton, who I said earlier, was is the most successful driver in Canada. He set the fastest time with a 1:13.718 on the soft compound of tire, even quicker than his teammate George Russell, which so far this season it's looked like Russell has kind of been maybe, especially last season. I think this year Lewis Hamilton's kind of stepped it up more, but last year was definitely Russell who was the much better driver.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that was just Hamilton getting used to that
Yeah.
new car, but then again, it was nice to see Hamilton back up there and Russell too, so Mercedes won too. But then
Yeah.
after that, things took a severe turn and it
Yeah.
started to rain, and it was
And
at
really
first light.
heavily.
It was light rain, but then it got like all of a sudden it became really heavy. Like the drivers had just pitted for intermediate tires, and then it got so heavy, especially down at the hairpin
Yeah.
area. It was just pouring down. It would have been a red flag if it was
Yeah.
during a race. But since it was practice, like all the drivers anyway just pitted.
Yeah.
Like there was no point in running wet weather. In doing any wet weather running when you could like risk crashing the
Yeah.
car. So Valtteri Bottas made a joke. It was good weather for a duck.
Yeah.
Because it was literally like a river down there.
Yeah,
Like
it was.
the intermediates wouldn't be able to clear enough water.
Even the full
Even the
wets,
full
yeah.
wets would have struggled with that. So it was pretty bizarre.
Yeah. Early on in FP2, though, before the rain, we saw an issue with Nico Hulkenberg's Haas as he retired after smoke just started pouring out of the back of his Haas at turn 1. So he had to pull over and he just said he lost drive. And that brought out a red flag as well.
And it was pretty strange because like Hulkenberg, he had really good running. Like Haas didn't have
Yeah.
anything unusual. Like from what I remember, there wasn't any radio or anything before saying like Hulkenberg
Yeah.
might have had a problem. He didn't think there was anything wrong. Like normally you would feel like something
Yeah.
is going and then it's gone, but there was nothing like that, and
Yeah.
it just went immediately.
Yeah. Also for Alpine, it was double disaster for them because in FP1 it was Pierre Gasly who DNF'd, and now in FP2 it was Esteban Ocon who had an issue with his car. So just like double trouble for them and not what they needed at all, especially with the limited running that they've had so far.
Yeah, another thing too, for Williams, they brought upgrades to this
Yeah.
weekend, but they only had enough for Alex Albon's car, or for
Yeah.
one car, but they chose Alex Albon obviously,
Yeah.
because he would make the most use of those upgrades, and so Sargent's upgrades would come later through the year, and so
Yeah.
it was a massive effort by Williams though to even get that one car's upgrades out. So.
Yeah.
Sargent will have to wait, but if he improves his performances and he shows that he is doing good with the current spec car right now, he'll prove to Williams that he'll be flying with those new upgrades. So it's just all about Sargent keeping consistent now.
Yeah. So at the end of FP2 then, it was Lewis Hamilton P1, George Russell P2, 2/100ths off of his teammate, Sainz 3rd, Alonso 4th, Leclerc 5th, then Verstappen, Bottas, Perez, Stroll, and Gasly. So moving on then into FP3 then, last chance before quali. This was actually a wet session, so not at all dry running. And immediately what we saw some struggles with the Ferrari of Carlos Sainz as he lost the rear at turn 1 and spun and hit the wall really heavily and broke his front wing and some of its suspension.
Yeah, this happened towards the end of the session almost, but
Yeah.
or in the middle around when the track had become intermediate conditions.
Yeah.
And it was in that like sort of crossover period between full wet and intermediate. So the
Yeah.
inters weren't still fully up to temperature, and so into turn 1, Sainz just downshifted and the rear tires didn't have enough grip, so he just spun around and hit the wall, and it was pretty nasty looking impact on because the rear wing was broken and the front of the car was just completely gone.
Yeah.
And another thing too that was unique about Canada this year that we forgot to mention earlier was they added a new wall on the exit of turn 1. Normally if you locked up into turn 1, you would go straight on and cut turn 2, but now they added a wall there. So I think it's pretty dangerous because thankfully we didn't see, but I thought a driver would surely lock up and go like hit that wall. But thankfully none of that happened, but it just
Yeah.
made drivers have to avoid that now.
Yeah. And also for Carlos Sainz's session too, it wasn't looking like a pretty good one because before he crashed out, he was also reported for impeding Alex Albon. Albon was very frustrated as he was coming through the chicane, and then Sainz was just right there, and Albon was like really upset about it as usual. And even again too, Albon on the same car, another Sainz was also there at the same spot.
Yeah, I mean, just ridiculous. But
Yeah.
like twice in a row, like once I can understand, but twice that's got to be like I don't know.
That's definitely like dangerous.
Yeah, and it wasn't like it was just practice. It wasn't even qualifying. So you can sacrifice starting your lap time, like starting with like a slow lap time. Like you don't need to start that quickly. Like if he saw Albon, he could have just gotten out of the way
Yeah.
a bit early. Like I know I can. It sounds stupid by just saying like, oh, he could just get out of the way. But like if he just let Albon go through on that apex, Sainz could have just started his lap a bit slower, but he would have still gotten the lap done ultimately, and Albon wouldn't have lost that lap.
Yeah. So Max Verstappen too as well was flying again in these conditions. We obviously know Max Verstappen is a bit of a rain master himself.
Yeah.
And so he set the quickest time of this session on the intermediate tires. So but again, he was just complaining about his downshifts even in this session too. So clearly the efforts from FP2 weren't working.
Yeah, that was unusual again because I thought they had gotten it fixed, and
Yeah.
then they came on the radio again, and Verstappen was still complaining. But it seemed like it wasn't doing too much to affect his performance. But
Yeah.
clearly, it's not what you want to hear as a driver if you hear like the downshift's not working properly.
Yeah. We also saw Fernando Alonso in his Aston Martin continue to show how quick he is, but he was also complaining about traffic down at the hairpin. Yuki Tsunoda was in his way, and he made a funny remark saying, "Who is the blind guy in the Alpha Tauri?" And even his engineer was playing along with it, saying, "That's Tsunoda who's blind."
That was
So
funny.
yeah,
I
but
think the one thing in Canada this year, like it was raining so much, like
yeah,
you couldn't see anything first of all, just regularly. But then another thing, the mirrors on the Formula One cars are so small that seeing anything
yeah.
through them first of all is like pretty hard. But then in rain just makes it impossible. So that's probably the reason why there was so much impeding.
Yeah, that's funny that you say they're small because they've actually been made larger for this year. Last year they were even
Yeah.
smaller.
Because of these new cars, obviously.
Yeah.
But
The
but
cars
then
are also
again,
much bigger.
then again, also the tires too are bigger, so that makes drivers have to look around the tire more
Yeah.
to see the apex. Everything has just been enlarged in general, but still, obviously, if the drivers could increase the mirror size, they would.
Yeah. So we also saw then Yuki Tsunoda have two spins this session. The first one came at the exit of the corner where Vettel first like where he lost it in 2019
Turn
in
3
that
and 4.
controversial moment. Yeah, and then the second one was at turn 1 and the entry of turn 2 when he lost it and just went off into the gravel or the grass right there.
He did good to keep it out of the wall, though. That was
Yeah.
pretty impressive.
Yeah. Lewis Hamilton and George Russell, for some reason in this session, were not in the wet conditions. They were just having a lot of trouble trying to get their tires in the right temperature and the right working window. So they were instead, like, they were finished down in, like, 10th and 15th. So it was not a good session for them at all.
But in the end, it was Max Verstappen
Yeah.
fastest in FP3, and then Charles Leclerc, he was P2, so that was really impressive from him, who had been like obviously a miserable weekend in Barcelona. He would be looking to bounce back in Montreal.
Yeah.
And then Alonso came third again, typical Fernando Alonso, always up there.
Yeah.
But then Kevin Magnussen too, it was a really good effort from Kevin Magnussen, a really great
Yeah.
effort. Fourth, obviously it was wet, but also that just getting it up there against the likes of Carlos Sainz in the Ferrari. In fifth, he was still stayed in fifth even though he had that crash. And then Pierre Gasly came sixth, and Stroll, it was P7, which is okay, but then compared to the pace of Alonso, it's pretty disappointing.
Yeah.
Especially at his home race too. Stroll would definitely want to improve. Then Yuki Tsunoda came 8th in the Alpha Tauri, then Bottas 9th, and Hamilton in 10th.
Yeah, so moving on into qualifying then into Q1, it was going to be another wet session, but it would dry out later on in the session. But in Q1 then towards the end, we saw Pierre Gasly trying to complete his final lap as he was in P14 at the time, so very close to getting in the relegation zone. And we saw just a whole mess of traffic at the final chicane and such a just a dangerous overall thing. We saw Tsunoda do his best to just cut the chicane and get out of the way, but Sainz was parked right there on the apex and he didn't even seem to move, so Gasly just had to take the runoff area and he was just fuming about it. So Sainz, again, that's 3 times in 1 day now that he's been caught at that chicane impeding someone, and that cost Gasly because he wasn't able to improve on his lap time, so he stayed in P14. And by the time others improved like Bottas and Ocon and everyone else who was coming in behind, that was it for Gasly. He was in the relegation zone.
And you can understand why he was on a really good lap.
Yeah.
He would have been propelled way up there, but unfortunately Sainz and him just like clashed at the wrong moment. And so it's pretty disappointing for Gasly.
And also for Sainz, because that's a slam dunk penalty for Sainz coming his way.
He got a penalty for that.
Yeah. So as others improved their times, we saw Joe crossed the line. He was out of qualifying too. Oscar Piastri did really well to get up into P9, which dropped to P10 as Russell went up to P4. And then we saw then Yuki Tsunoda in his AlphaTauri. He couldn't improve. Sainz was able to improve and go to P11, so he would get into Q2. So the 5 that we lost from Q1 were Tsunoda, Gasly, De Vries, Logan Sargent, who tried to improve. He went up to P18 at best, but then when others improved, he was down in P19. And surprisingly, Zhou Guanyu in 20th as well.
Zhou Guanyu was a surprise for me. I
Yeah.
thought he would have had more pace in the Alfa Romeo.
Yeah.
And even Sargent qualified ahead of him, so that's pretty disappointing from Zhou.
Yeah. I mean, it is Sargent's first time at this track, too.
Yeah.
He did well, I'm not even going to lie, he didn't even do that good of a job, yeah. 6/10 off the time to get eliminated. Not even like the time off the fastest time. 6/10 alone off the time that you need to get eliminated is pretty shocking.
Yeah.
Yes, he doesn't have the upgrades, but still, it's pretty like shocking time.
So going into Q2 now, immediately we saw Lance Stroll spin
Yeah.
at in turn 5, and he did really well to keep it out of the wall actually there. Like that section of the track is really narrow. We saw him in 2018 tangle with Brendan Hartley.
Yeah.
But here he was able to keep it out of the wall, and so that was pretty impressive.
Yeah, so going on until later on into Q2, with 9 minutes remaining, we saw Alex Albon go quickest in the Williams because he was on the soft compounder tire. Everyone else was on the intermediates. So Williams listened to Albon's request for the softs, and it paid off because by 6/10 of a second he was quickest by now. But there were still drivers improving, as Alonso, who had gone quickest in the first sector, lost a lot of time though in the very last sector. He went up to second, 3/10 off of Albon. So that's, I think, especially in the middle sectors and final sectors where Albon's just gaining so much time. Norris tried to improve, but he couldn't, as he only went up to P12, but there was still time for one more run at least for all the drivers.
Yeah, and Williams showed they were reading the conditions well with Albon.
Yeah.
So Albon had another run on the soft tires, and again extended his advantage by 7/10 of a second.
Yeah.
So the soft tire gamble for Williams was really paying off for them.
Yeah. And then we saw Norris go up to P3 on the soft compound, so all the drivers were now starting to get on the softs. And there was news from Ferrari that heavy rain was going to be on the way soon, so drivers were now rushing to get their lap times in. We saw Ocon cross the line to go in P8, so very close though. Hulkenberg then went up to P8, so now Hamilton was the driver at risk. And so now everyone was just trying to improve their times. And Sergio Perez in the relegation zone, by the time qualifying ended, he could not hook a lap up together. He was on the intermediate tire still for some reason, but he aborted his lap at the very end.
He couldn't even get a benchmark lap on his intermediate tires. Same with Leclerc, but in Leclerc's case, Ferrari, he asked Ferrari if he could be on the soft tires, but Ferrari said no.
Yeah.
So again, Ferrari messing up Leclerc's strategy.
Yeah. But Sergio Perez, you could just see the look on Christian Horner's face. Sergio Perez, like another shocking qualifying for him. Mm-hmm. He's just been in a poor run of form ever since Miami, really, where Verstappen kind of ran away with that race, where he was looking to make a run for the title this year, taking like 2 wins earlier this season. Now all of his momentum is just slipping away.
Yeah, Daniel Ricciardo will be really happy watching all of this.
Yeah. No. We saw Leclerc too, because he was on the intermediate tires, he just couldn't get his tires into the right temperature, so he just locked up into one of the corners. I think turn 5 it is. He made a mistake
Turn
there.
6, yeah.
Turn 6, yeah.
And
so the 5 we lost from Q2 were Leclerc, Perez, Stroll in his home race. Surprisingly, Kevin Magnussen too.
I was surprised.
And Valtteri Bottas. So I guess just both Alfa Romeos just could not hook up a lap together.
Now, going into Q3, we saw the drivers set their first times, and Verstappen immediately set the benchmark of a 1:21.0, and so we waited for the rest to challenge.
Yeah.
And Ocon went up to second, but that was a second and a tenth down on Verstappen.
That's
so
crazy.
It was Verstappen had a really big margin, and so the only one who could really challenge was Fernando Alonso at that point.
Yeah. But Alonso, he said a purple middle sector. But when he crossed the line, by 2 tenths he was down on Verstappen still. So he was just P2. Norris was up there in P3. Sainz went up to P6 behind Hulkenberg. Hulkenberg was up there in P5. So really good from Haas. Hamilton then went up to P3 surprisingly after struggling in the wet conditions earlier in practice. Then Russell went up to P4 too. So both Mercedes finding a way to get their tires in the right working window.
Yeah, it looked like Mercedes had a lot of pace in after the first runs, but then once again Verstappen came and smashed his lap time, finding another second and 2 tenths.
Yeah.
And extending that gap against Fernando Alonso. And then we saw at the exit of turn 7, we saw Oscar Piastri hit the wall, his rear wing completely broken on his McLaren, and that brought out a red flag. Yeah. But right at that red flag, we saw Hulkenberg go P2.
Yeah, so literally right before the red flag came out, Hulkenberg went up to P2. Alonso was right there, but he was not able to get his lap in because the red flag came out. So yeah, and also then after the red flag, we saw just the rain was getting heavier and heavier. So obviously they set their times on intermediate tires. So I think by the time then it was full wets. So that was it for the grid. The cars just went up it back into the pit lane because there was no point because you can't improve your time.
Yeah.
So that was the final grid that we were going to see so far before penalties were applied. So in terms of the starting grid then, Nico Hulkenberg. So Max Verstappen was starting on pole. Nico Hulkenberg, due to start on the front row after that incredible P2 qualifying, was given a penalty for not going slow enough under red flags.
Such a shame for Hulkenberg.
Yeah, I don't know what the point of that penalty was, but he got a 5-place grid penalty, meaning he would start, or 3-place grid penalty because he was starting P5 then, not on the front row, and that was just a shame to see.
Yeah.
So Fernando Alonso then, for the second year in a row, would start P2, then Hamilton 3rd, Russell 4th, Hulkenberg 5th, Ocon 6th, Norris 7th, Piastri 8th, Albon 9th, and Leclerc 10th. Carlos Sainz was given grid penalties after impeding multiple people, so he dropped down into P11. So that meant Charles Leclerc would start in P10, and everyone else behind Sainz would move up a place.
Yeah, Sainz, it was a slam dunk penalty for Sainz. Like twice he impeded people, so he had to start P11.
Yeah, we also saw some drivers. I think didn't some drivers have to start from the pit lane as well in this race?
I don't think so, but also Sonoda and Stroll got also 3 places for impeding other people. So it was just penalties all around basically for the FIA.
Yeah. So moving on to the race then, this race was going to be a dry race, surprisingly. So now we would see some real pace from the cars and real speed from them. So as the lights went out then, it was a good start from Max Verstappen. He just shot clear of Fernando Alonso. And Lewis Hamilton also had a really good start as he got ahead of Alonso into turn 1. And behind Alonso, we saw Ocon challenging Hulkenberg in the Haas. But then Ocon then, as the outside line turned into the inside line, he was able to get that more momentum. And he was able to get past the Haas of Nico Hulkenberg. And we also saw Fernando Alonso and George Russell going wheel to wheel together, but Alonso had the inside line and he was able to keep his place.
Yeah, it was very crucial for Hamilton to get ahead of Alonso so he could try and challenge Verstappen in that early stage. Yeah. And also another thing, Albon was able to stay ahead of Perez, and so that was crucial for him because Perez, obviously, once he's released, he would be expected to be flying because he's in a Red Bull.
Yeah. So then throughout the first lap, then we saw just the drivers now keeping their places and the first lap keeping clean. We saw one of the Ferraris, it was putting pressure on Sergio Perez in the
Carlos Sainz.
Yeah, Carlos Sainz, and he was actually able to get ahead of Sergio Perez into that quick right to left chicane, and he got past the Ferrari, and now he would be chasing after Alex Albon. So that's exactly what Perez needed. But then at the end of the long straight back into the chicane, we saw Sainz get past Sergio Perez again, and Kevin Magnussen too got caught out by both of them, so he had to slam on the brakes and he touched the grass, so he went straight on off of there, and which meant he had to take the runoff area to avoid a big crash.
Yeah, we saw Sainz out dragging the Red Bull. So
Yeah.
the Ferrari out dragging the Red Bull. That was pretty impressive to see from Carlos Sainz, and he was able to get ahead of Sergio Perez, as you said. But then
Yeah.
moving on to lap 7, it was heartbreak for Logan Sargent, who
Yeah.
had to retire with an engine issue, and so he pulled out on the exit of turn 6.
Yeah.
And so that was really disappointing for Sargent.
Mm-hmm. Going on to lap 10, then we saw Oscar Piastri get past the Haas of Nico Hulkenberg to move up into P6. So really good from Oscar Piastri, as he was also ahead of his teammate too, Lando Norris.
Yeah, the McLaren's running their normal livery again this year.
Yeah.
And so Piastri was improving, and he was actually outperforming Lando Norris.
Yeah. Then all of a sudden on lap 12 we saw some yellow flags being thrown out, and we saw George Russell had hit the wall at the same place where earlier Sainz had got past Sergio Perez. He just on the left hand corner, he just got trigger happy.
Turn 8 and 9. I think.
Yeah, he got trigger happy with the throttle and just lost the rear end and hit his rear right tire on that wall and broke his front wing too as well and got a puncture as well.
That was really surprising to see from Russell, because normally he never makes mistakes like that.
Yeah.
And so just to over push it like that and hit the wall, he took too much entry curb.
Yeah.
And that cost him on the exit. So that was really, or no, I think he went wide on the entry, and then
Yeah.
he took too much exit curb, and so that's what cost him. But then all the drivers started pitting
Because this was a safety car that brought out because of all the debris.
and so we saw Hamilton and Alonso come out really close together, and Alonso got out ahead, but then Hamilton came out in front of Alonso because the Mercedes pit box is ahead of the Aston Martin, and so we saw Alonso doing a bunch of hand motions and jolting the car back and forth, trying to show that it was an unsafe release from the Mercedes, even though it really wasn't. And it was just funny to see Alonso trying to bait the FIA into giving Hamilton a penalty. That was pretty funny.
Even Toto Wolff you saw was mocking Alonso, just doing this and everything, just imitating Alonso.
Yeah, that was funny.
Yeah. But then moving on, then we saw one of the McLarens too on lap 12. They also pit as well, and they double stacked as well. So it was a really good stop from McLaren as they double stacked. So moving on into lap 17 on the safety car restart at the hairpin, we saw Lando Norris just absolutely send it on the inside of his teammate Oscar Piastri on the hard compound tire too, and so he was able to get past.
Yeah, that was an important move for Norris, because under the safety car, he got a 5-second penalty for driving too slowly to try to create that gap to double stack at McLaren. But the FIA labeled it as unsportsmanlike behavior, which I can see that because it is slowing down other cars. So that's not what you're supposed to do, and so that's why it was a slam dunk penalty from the FIA.
Yeah. So, but that was an important move for Norris as well, as he would continue to charge through the field, and he would eventually, on lap 20, get past Alex Albon, and then we saw Oscar Piastri get past Albon, but then he would lock up into the chicane and go straight on, and he would lose the place to not only Albon, but also Sonoda, I think, as well.
No, he just stayed behind Albon, but he kept having to try and fight Albon, and then on lap 20 we saw Kevin Magnussen. He was having some issues with his car, and so unfortunately for him, he would have to pull off. He would have to give the place back. Actually, it wasn't issues. He had to give a place back because he overtook under safety car, which you're not supposed to do. So the FIA had a lot of lenience, and they just said, okay, you guys are gonna sort it out on track. So Magnussen just gave the position back to Valtteri Bottas, and so it was nicely handled from the team.
Yeah, then on to lap 21, we saw Lando Norris get past Kevin Magnussen again, or tried to, into turn 1. He went actually around the outside of him at turn 1, so some really good late braking from him to go around the outside, and then which turned into the inside line, and he got the move done.
It was a really big train, 12th or 10th all the way down to George Russell in 19th, so that was a really long train.
Then on lap 22, we saw Fernando Alonso get past Lewis Hamilton into the final chicane. He sent it up the inside of his former teammate and got past, and then had the DRS again to keep the Mercedes behind, and so he was up into P2 now to try to chase after Max Verstappen.
It was a crucial move from Alonso because I think he felt he would have been able to challenge Verstappen for this win, so he could not be stuck behind Hamilton.
Yeah. Then on lap 35, we saw Kevin Magnussen in the Haas fighting with Nick de Vries, and Nick de Vries and them went really wide because Magnussen forced de Vries to go really wide, and that just completely opened the door for George Russell, who kind of like had his through goes Hamilton moment.
Yeah,
As soon as
basically.
he got past then, so that he would be really happy with that. But then we saw de Vries try to lunge it up the inside again.
At turn 3 and 4.
Yeah, and he went straight on into the runoff area, but also collected Kevin Magnussen with him because Magnussen obviously had nowhere to turn because de Vries was right there. So both of them got caught out in that runoff area.
And because that part of that runoff is so narrow, like,
Yeah.
and de Vries was there, Magnussen couldn't just loop it around and do like
Yeah.
a 360, so he had to do a 3-point turn to get that car back, and
Yeah.
it would have been really frustrating for Kevin Magnussen right there.
Yeah. On lap 40, then we saw Sergio Perez get past Alex Albon with the supreme straight line speed of the Red Bull. So that was a very easy move, and it was just cool to see how quick the Red Bull was compared to the Williams.
Yeah, and then though going on to lap 49, we
Yeah.
saw George Russell trying to chase after Alex Albon, and this is where we would see Albon like start to show what he would be known for in this race,
Yeah.
and that was his really good defending. He kept George Russell and that whole train of cars behind him for so long
Yeah.
in P7, holding on to that P7 spot until on lap 55 George Russell had to retire from this
Yeah.
race. There were just too many problems with the car, like the brakes were gone, and so he had to retire from the race. And Canada is a track that's really tough on the brakes
Yeah,
because
it
there's
is.
so many chicanes, there's so many braking zones. It was really tough for these cars here. We've seen both the Mercedes had to or Hamilton had to retire in 2014 with brake issues on his car. Nico Rosberg got severely
Oh, yeah.
he lost a lot of time with his brake issues, and ultimately that led Daniel Ricciardo to his first win in F1. So it was no surprise here, I guess, that Mercedes
Yeah.
had brake issues.
Moving on to lap 64, then we saw Norris send it up the inside of Valtteri Bottas at the hairpin, and Bottas tried to come back at him with the switchback, but then Norris just had the DRS as well, and he was just able to get past the Alfa Romeo under braking into the chicane, and that was an important move for him as well to try to chase after the pack.
And get ahead for that 5-second penalty.
Yeah.
And we saw Albon still once again holding back
Yeah.
Esteban Ocon to keep that P7.
Yeah. On lap 65, then we saw a very funny moment from Verstappen at the same corner where Russell crashed. On that exit curb, he kind of launched himself up and said like he almost knocked himself out, and he was laughing about it. So
was
he was just
funny.
like out in front, just doing minding his own business.
Like not having a worry because he knows he won't make a mistake. He's just that confident. So that was really funny to see.
Yeah. On lap 67, then 2 laps later, we saw Norris right behind Ocon, and we saw Norris just complaining about Ocon's rear wing because of the instability of it.
It was really loose. I'm not sure if that was by design or not, but his rear wing was
I think that was
flopping.
like a faulty thing. There's no way it would be like that severely wobbling around.
It was flopping around a lot, especially on the end of the straights when like DRS was open and stuff like that. When the aero load is really high on the
Yeah.
rear wing, it was really unusual to see. And so Norris was trying to get the black and orange flag called on the Alpine, so
Yeah.
Ocon would have to pit. But that didn't happen, unfortunately for Norris, but fortunately for Ocon.
Yeah, so moving on to lap 70, Norris would not be able to get past, but Max Verstappen was just in a league of his own, and once again he won the Canadian Grand Prix for a second time in his career, and he made it back-to-back wins in Canada, and he took Red Bull's 100th victory in F1, so that was an incredible achievement for him and for Red Bull as well.
Yeah, obviously starting out in 2005, they've come away
Yeah.
with so much now. Like, they have 6 drivers' titles, 5 constructors' titles.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. 100 wins now is really incredible for Red Bull.
Yeah. So then we saw Fernando Alonso claim another podium for Aston Martin this season in a really good drive to take second place. And then Lewis Hamilton in P3 for Mercedes on the podium again in Canada after a really good drive from him. Then we saw the two Ferraris of Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz bring home a really, really solid P4 and P5 after a pretty good strategy from
It
Ferrari
was
for
actually a
once.
good strategy this
Yeah.
time. They brought their cars up from 10th and 11th to 4th and 5th. Really
Yeah.
good strategy from Ferrari.
Then we saw Sergio Perez in 6th after a pretty okay result for him considering where he started. Then
Still not a good result
Yeah.
for Red Bull though, but he did take the fastest lap, which was what would like be one
Yeah.
of his only highs of this weekend.
Then we saw right to the line a thrilling photo finish as Lando Norris and Esteban Ocon were fighting to the very end. Ocon then pushed Norris off the track, and Norris had to take the runoff area. But it would be Alex Albon who would come home in P7 after a really, really good drive and score lots of points for Williams. Then Ocon would cross the line in 8th, Norris 9th, and then fighting it to the finish, we saw Lance Stroll just right on the line overtake Bottas.
It was like a mirror image of what
Yeah.
happened in Baku 2017 when Bottas took it off Stroll. This
Yeah.
time Stroll took it off Bottas, but they would both get in the points because Norris's 5-second penalty would
Yeah.
drop him to I think like P11 or
P13, it dropped
Oh,
him down like a
P13.
really big amount.
yeah. So Bottas would still score a world championship point.
Yeah. So that was pretty much it for the Canadian Grand Prix. So thank you guys for listening to this episode of our podcast, and be sure to join us next time when we take a look at the 2023 Austrian Grand Prix. Thank you.